Joining us now is Caleb Maupin, political analyst, journalist, and writer, author of several books, including Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, The Whole Story, and The Houthis. Who are the Houthis? What are they fighting for? Those two books are readily available online. Welcome to the show, Caleb.
Sure, glad to be here as always.
So let's start with what's happening in Venezuela. The United States Navy and the Marine Corps have a significant military presence in the southern Caribbean, more specifically in the vicinity of Venezuela's coast. We heard yesterday that the Trump administration is claiming that they bombed, to all intents and purposes, a boat seen leaving the coast and claiming it was part of a gang that was transporting drugs. What do you think is the real objective behind this build-up?
Well, the first thing that needs to be pointed out is it's very unlikely that this boat was actually involved in the drug trade, because if that was the case, they would have, rather than just sinking it and killing the 11 people on board and having all the evidence go to the bottom of the ocean, they would have seized it and arrested the people on board and used whatever evidence was on that ship to further make their case that Maduro is a drug trafficker. But they didn't do that. They instead just decided to just destroy the evidence and the people, which is very, very interesting. Maduro has made clear they are not a narco state, and he has the confirmation of that from the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. They have done many reports showing that Venezuela is really an insignificant country in Latin America's drug trade. 70% of the drugs produced in Latin America come from Colombia. And if you look at a map, there is no reason that they should then go through Venezuela to get them to the United States. It just doesn't make geographical sense. And that there is a big problem with drug gangs throughout that region, South and Central America, no doubt. But the idea that Venezuela is somehow heavily involved in the drug trade or a narco state, it just doesn't add up. And, many other international actors who don't like Venezuela, many other voices from the NATO countries and others have said these claims that are coming from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, being echoed by Trump, they don't match the reality. They do have drugs in Venezuela, just like any other country. There are criminal organizations that exist there. But the idea that there's some kind of important hub in the drug trade and that fighting Venezuela is a big effort to fight the drug gangs, that just doesn't add up. It doesn't match the facts, according to all the experts on the drug problem in Latin America.
The State Department has raised a reward for Maduro because they've accused President Nicolas Maduro of heading a narco cartel, up to $50 million, and boasted he was the first target in the history of the narcotics reward program, with a reward offering of exceeding $25 million. How unusual is this escalation, and what purpose does it serve?
Well, Venezuela, they had a president, Hugo Chavez, who put oil under public ownership and then used the oil wealth to build up kind of a state-run economy that is subsidized in the name of socialism of the 21st century, Bolivarian socialism. And they have been able to eradicate illiteracy in the country. They have lifted millions of people out of poverty, and they had a pretty severe food crisis as a result of the oil price drop and the sanctions put on the country. But that's over, and they've actually recovered very significantly. And at this point, they're producing their own food domestically. They have a very close relationship with Iran and with Russia and with China, and they're just kind of a bastion of the new economy that's arising in the world, the BRICS economy, on the continent of South America. And they're a country that has long been a target. And if you listen to what Maduro has pointed out, he has said that basically Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, who is, a Miami Cuban himself, from a Cuban family in Miami, that he is part of what they call the Miami Mafia, which is a layer of people who've been displaced by governments like the Cuban government, like the Venezuelan government, that have fled to Miami and fled to the United States, and they have a particular bone to pick, a particular grudge against the Marxist governments of Latin America. And one thing that these experts on drugs never want to point to is that one of the greatest examples of getting rid of the drug trade in Latin America is a country that's heavily aligned with Venezuela, and that's Cuba. Cuba has almost no drug traffickers in it. For an island nation in the Caribbean, Cuba has completely wiped out the drug trade. There is no drug problem in Cuba, and Cuba trains the Venezuelan military. The Venezuelan military goes to Cuba pretty frequently for military training. There are Cuban military forces in Venezuela cooperating with the Venezuelan military. So if anything, if Maduro continues to gain strength, he actually has the potential to cooperate with one of the most effective anti-drug countries in the region and perhaps wipe out the drug trade. So the idea that Maduro is a narco leader or something, this doesn't match reality. This is Marco Rubio's agenda, and that so-called Miami Mafia, that's what Maduro calls it, but the anti-Cuba lobby, that is particularly important in the Trump coalition. And right now, Trump is pivoting in ways those folks don't like, trying to get closer to Russia, trying to move away from the NATO countries. So I guess it looks like, escalating against Venezuela, sending the U.S. military, the Navy off to the coast of Venezuela to threaten Venezuela. It looks like this could be some kind of compromise that's being made as Trump pivots kind of in the opposite direction of where those forces want when it comes to the global stage, but perhaps throwing them a bone, giving them something when it comes to their particular pet issues closer to home.
Right. This interest in Venezuela has occurred, it's gone on for several decades now. In 2019, Washington recognized this, obscure Venezuelan legislator, Juan Guaido, as the president of Venezuela, even though 81% of Venezuelans didn't even know who he was at the time. What about these past events and tactics that the U.S. has used to, try and get its hands on it's got the world's largest oil and gas reserves, and this is obviously of interest.
Well, the main thing is they've been trying to get Venezuela's oil off the market. Venezuela is now a competitor with Wall Street. They had a state-run oil company prior to Hugo Chavez, but that state-run oil company just kind of functioned as a middleman for Wall Street. But now Venezuela, they are selling oil on the international markets as competitors. And there has been a huge effort to drive them off the market because they want people buying oil from ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron. They don't like Russia for similar reasons. They don't like Iran for similar reasons. These are countries that used to be kind of captive markets, and now they're the opposite. They're competitors, and they don't want competition. The interesting thing, though, is that, Venezuela, they have been able to maintain a close relationship with China, and China is a purchaser of their oil. Another thing to point out is that, Venezuela has tried very, very hard to stay out of anything involving criminals, but it's the sanctions from the United States that have, to some degree, it looks like, been an effort to try and push them to cooperating with criminals. Because if you're blocked from transactions in major banks, you're going to have to negotiate with people that know how to engage in bank fraud and things like that. It looks like, as the USA was, pushing Venezuela out of the SWIFT system and out of the official banking apparatus, that Venezuela, who are they going to turn to, right? And that these criminal organizations in Latin America, they know how to manipulate the international banking system. And so if anything, the USA is kind of trying to push Venezuela into the arms of the drug cartels because that would be the only way they could make bank transfers and have transactions, et cetera. We remember that Alex Saab, who was a Venezuelan diplomat, a man born in Colombia, he was grabbed by U.S. officials and held by the Biden administration in Miami for several years before ultimately being returned to Venezuela. And he was somebody who, it was alleged, apparently had connections to organized crime. And the allegation was that he was helping Venezuela navigate the international banking system after the USA pushed them out. Well, if you don't want Venezuela to have to cooperate and do that, let them be part of the regular banking system, right? Let them just, trade on Wall Street and trade in the London Stock Exchange like any other country. So the USA is basically trying to push Venezuela into the arms of the drug cartels. But it looks like they have effectively resisted that. And what's being said by Marco Rubio and Trump just doesn't match what's being said by international observers and experts on the drug trade. Venezuela has problems with drugs, but nowhere near as big as Colombia, nowhere near as big as Ecuador. Ecuador is now increasingly becoming a major hub of the drug cartels. And that is something that's being ignored in U.S. media pretty significantly. But since Ecuador pivoted away from Bolivarianism, since Correa was removed, the current leadership of Ecuador has pushed Ecuador closer and closer into the drug trade, and drug trafficking in Ecuador is rising. And you never hear anything about that from the United States, of course.
Right. Now, if we could pivot to the other side of the world and talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin. Some people have called this a pivotal moment in the evolution towards a new world order. In your view, what makes this summit so decisive compared to earlier gatherings?
Well, the timing is important because it was timed to coincide with the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Japan, Victory in Asia Day, VA Day, the defeat of Japan in the Second World War. And there was just a parade where Russian President Vladimir Putin, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and Chinese President Xi Jinping all marched together in this big military parade that just happened to celebrate the victory over Japan. Donald Trump was invited. They wanted Japan to be there because it was American support for China against the Japanese that secured their victory. However, Donald Trump didn't appear. Even today, there's a phrase that they use in the U.S. Marine Corps, gung-ho. Well, gung-ho, that was actually the slogan of the Chinese Industrial Cooperative Association. It means all together. And it was popularized in the U.S. military because the U.S. Marine Corps adopted some of the military training tactics of Mao Zedong during the Second World War, and there was a Hollywood movie called Gung Ho that popularized it. So when fascism was being defeated, and when Japan was the enemy of the United States along with Nazi Germany, the USA and Chinese Communist Party were happy to work together. But now, obviously, that's not the case. And so this big meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization happened at the same time as the big parade. Now, Putin, the Russian leader, just has given a press conference at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization event. He emphasized that in a multipolar world, all countries should be treated equally and treated with respect. They emphasized technological advancements, the possibility. There was a discussion, apparently, between Kim Jong-un and President Xi and President Putin about how they're going to aim to raise the human life expectancy to 150 years, which I find to be very interesting. But they are arguing that now with AI and biotechnology, human organs can be replaced. And it could be very possible within the next 20 years that we have human beings who live over 150 years old. That's very exciting. And the focus of the new BRICS economy, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Union, the focus is economic growth and development. These are countries that have been kept in poverty by colonialism, kept as captive markets of Wall Street, that have broken out as a result of the anti-colonial revolutions of the 20th century. And they've started on their own course of development. And their population is rising, and their life expectancy is rising. And they're setting up alternative networks of trade, alternative banking systems, alternative trade routes. The biggest thing that has happened, I will say, is that Russia and China signed an agreement to build a huge trans-Siberian natural gas pipeline. And that's a really big deal. There's going to be a huge natural gas pipeline connecting the Russian Far East and Siberia with China. And that is a huge deal. Donald Trump is kind of tap dancing and trying to downplay it because that's seen as kind of a loss for the United States. But the amount of natural gas that Russia is going to start selling to China is going to drastically increase. That's a huge win for Russia. A huge win for Russia because Russia has been, there's been efforts by the United States to isolate Russia, to prevent them from selling oil and gas on the international markets. China's purchases and energy relationship with Russia just greatly expanded as a result of this deal that was signed. And Donald Trump is almost kind of, backed into a corner here, looking bad because Russia and China are closer than ever before.
Right. Russian President Vladimir Putin has emphasized the Shanghai Cooperation Organization development program, saying it defines the group's strategic path for the decade. And now there's a call for an SCO development bank aimed at reducing dependence on Western financial institutions and lessening the impact of sanctions. Could this bank realistically rival the IMF and World Bank?
Well, China already has the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That's the Belt and Road Bank that they've been using to fund infrastructure projects. And a Shanghai Cooperation Organization bank could play a similar role. But again, this kind of gets back to what we were talking about with Venezuela. This is the game that the so-called collective West or the NATO countries or the old British Empire, Wall Street and London economic system, this is the game they play. If you don't do what they want, they lock you out of the banking transactions. You can't do SWIFT transactions. You can't transfer money. Well, this is China and Russia saying, all right, we'll set up our own banking system. And, we can just trade with each other this way. And this is the kind of thing that infuriates the Western countries. And that, in the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, if a country was at odds with the United States, like Iraq, like Cuba or North Korea, they could just be devastated by sanctions. Sanctions could just destroy them. Iraq lost about 500,000 children because they were locked out of the global economy. They were unable to import chlorine for their water system. North Korea had a food crisis in the 90s. Cuba, they did not have a food crisis. They didn't have a crisis of malnutrition, but they suffered a lot. I mean, they had electricity for only a few hours a day in some cities. It was pretty bad in the 90s. But the 90s is a really long time ago. This is 2025. And nowadays, if America doesn't like you and says, oh, we won't trade with you, you say, fine, we'll trade with Russia, we'll trade with China, we'll trade with Iran and Venezuela. What are you going to do about it? And the USA doesn't realize that putting sanctions on all these countries just expedites the process of people taking their money elsewhere, right? And that they don't have the ability to just cancel countries anymore, and that the more they do it, the less it's going to be effective, right? I think in the movie Star Wars, Princess Leia says, the more you tighten your grip, the more they'll slip out of your fingers. And that's kind of the situation we're in, that if anything, the USA should be smart and stop using sanctions like this, because it's only going to lead to further expediting the process of a new economy emerging and making more and more countries pull their money out of the Western system so they can keep doing business with countries that the West has sanctioned.
Also at this meeting was Turkish President Erdogan, a NATO leader, and they've described it as symbolic of Turkey's strategic flexibility. Does his participation signal a deeper shift away from NATO, or is it more of a hedging? Because they're kind of in the center of this.
Well, Turkey is technically a member of NATO, but President Erdogan is very, very anti-Israel. He took power. He was elected as an Islamist, which is a big deal in Turkey because Turkey's government has historically been quite secular and nationalist. But he was elected on an Islamist platform. He's a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood and the kind of westernized wing of Sunni Islam, and he's very anti-Israel, and that he has, to some degree or other, pivoted Turkey in an independent direction. Now, not always, when it comes to Libya, when it comes to some countries, he has, taken the U.S. side. So he's more of an independent leader. He's technically a member of NATO, but he's very anti-Israel, and he's very, very, very much willing to cooperate with Russia and China if they'll make him a better deal. And you can say the same about Modi. Modi, the leader of India, has a really big beef with China. China and India are not good friends. But if Russia will make a better deal, and even China, if they'll make a better deal for India, Modi is independent enough that he'll take the deal. And that's what we need to remember about Erdogan and Modi. And I think we should expect to see more governments like this that are not, fully on board with Russia and China, but are not fully on board with the United States either. And they'll go with either side that will make them a deal. And, Brazil is a country that plays a similar role to Turkey. And that this is kind of a third category that is rising of countries that will go either way. It kind of parallels the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. You could argue. And I think that Erdogan is very opposed to Israel. He represents an Islamic country. And at this point, he's looking towards the rising economy in the East because the Western system is tied in with Israel. And the Western countries are having big problems, not just the United States, but Europe, the refugee crisis, internal turmoil. So the West is not looking like the best place to do business necessarily. So he's playing both sides.
Got it. Caleb Maupin, insightful as always. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Sure. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.